Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I see everybody is starting to join, so we are just going to hang out, let folks join, and you know, you can take a look at Simon and me. It's always a fun activity to look at both of us. In the meantime, for those of you who are joining, thank you so much for joining us for avoiding common errors in CLM implementation, strategies for success. We are excited to dive into the discussion today. I'm very excited. I know Simon has been bouncing in his chair for the past 30 minutes while we've been preparing, but we are going to give it another 30 minutes or so, 30 seconds or so, maybe a minute or two, so that people can continue to join. I will go through some pre-webinar items and exciting notes before we start. And hopefully we don't scare you too much and you have a great time. So in the meantime, just give it a few minutes. We will be back in 60 seconds. By the way, if you're joining us now while we're still in this preparation phase, please feel free to go get a bottle of water, some water, a coffee, and hang out while we start. If you are dialing in, we will go through the slides. However, I will recommend that afterwards you'll get an email with a copy of the slideshow and an ability to watch it again later if you'd like. We do not read every word on the slides. If you do need something read aloud to you, please make sure to put a comment or put a note into the Q&A, and will be more than happy to read something out loud. But one of our big points is that we know that slides are there for help, but you're here to learn and not just have us read what's on the screen for you. So I'll give a couple more moments and we will get started. Okay, well, let's get this show on the road. Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us today for Avoiding Common Errors in CLM Implementation, Strategies for Success. Before we do get kicked off, I would like to mention a couple of brief housekeeping items. We do want the webinar to be as interactive as possible. We had a great time with this webinar and the folks involved at the Corporate Legal Operations Consortium conference. And so please use the Q&A button either at the top of your screen or bottom of the screen, depending on which Zoom interface you're in, to submit your questions for the panelists. And Essa, I see that you have a question. You will receive a copy of the recording and the slides within a week of this presentation. Sorry for cutting off your typed answer, Simon. So with that, I think we can get started. Really excited to be here. So first, Simon, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Jerry. So hello, folks. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. So Simon McCarthy, I'm our VP of Enterprise Transformation here at ContractPodAi. I've been in the contract lifecycle management space now for about 13 years. That journey actually started as a customer. I was implementing CLM myself into a business unit before ultimately joining the vendor space. Over that course of that journey, I've probably implemented CLM now about 120 times. So I've seen a good idea of what works well. And I guess some of the things we're going to be talking about today, which are the things that perhaps should be avoided or don't work so well. I also ran KPMG's contract lifecycle management practice for a period of time as well. So looking forward to talking to you today.
Thank you, Simon. And I'm Jerry Levine, Chief Evangelist and General Counsel here at ContractPodAi. I am a former ContractPodAi customer, many years of experience is being a lawyer and attorney as well. And a few years ago, I joined the company because it had really ContractPodAi had made my life as a GC so easy at my prior company that I said, you know what, this is really where I see the future of technology law going. So, of course, we're really excited here to talk about this, but also to talk about what can go wrong and how to avoid those issues. Because if you're like me, and I'm sure Simon's seen this as well, you know, you've learned that there's a lot that can go wrong. So it's important to make sure you take the right steps to make sure that things go as correctly as possible. That's not to say that it's bad. It's just that there's been learning experiences, and if we can share those with you, you know, then everybody can benefit and people don't make the same mistakes over and over. So, you know, I will read this one. This one will be fun. But Gartner says, and for those of you who are watching, that 50% of first-time CLM implementations, that contract lifecycle management, will fail to deliver the expected benefits as a result of unrealistic strategic technology roadmap. So, Simon, what are some of the common expectations that clients have about the implementation journey? And Simon, before you respond, I will remind the folks, if you do have a question or you don't know something, or we've said something that doesn't make sense, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. We'll either respond there, we'll respond at the end live, or if it's pressing enough, we'll be more than happy to take it right during the panel. But Simon, what are some common expectations that clients have that they have about the implementation journey? I guess that's really the question there.
Sure. Well, without giving too much away in terms of spoilers for some of our subsequent slides, I think the primary one at the heart of it is this is going to be easier than I think it is. You know, that's the reality. Is I think this is going to be easier, and I'm not necessarily ready. I'm not necessarily aware of what's coming. I haven't necessarily thought about what effort is involved in going on this journey. And this has got to be, you know, it's cutting edge technology. So it's got to be as simple as downloading an app on my phone and getting up and running, right? I can be up and running really, really quickly. And there's not a lot of prep work, I think is part of the crux of the story. And I think that has been embellished over the years, historically, by vendors who have made or doubled down on that messaging along the way to say, this is super, super simple. You really don't have to worry. And then everybody has these cool, calm expectations about what they're walking into. And then as soon as the implementation starts, the reality is very different.
You know, you said something interesting there. So one thing that it sounds like folks should keep in mind during this is that, you know, there's different types of software, that there's different types of solutions. You've got some solutions that are extremely, extremely simple, where the onboarding is like that of a mobile app where you don't have to do much. And then you've got these bespoke, completely customizable solutions on the other hand, but it's those middle ground that seem to trip people up. And the fact is I would say that most business applications are in that middle ground. You don't just pick them up on day one and go, I can use this with no training. Is that, or no preparation? It's more that you have to know what you're getting into. Am I getting that right?
You're absolutely right, Jerry. And I think there's no one size fits all when it comes to CLM either. And I think there's a desire to gravitate beyond some of the base capabilities and immediately advance into the shiny new toys that come along with CLM. And I'm sure as we go through today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those things, the Gen AI craze, etc. but really thinking about what do I need on day one. I'm typically moving from a world where I don't have anything and my digital transformation journey is just beginning. So thinking about what do I actually need on day one to be up and running? The basics, like I need a repository. I need something that's searchable, indexable. I can store stuff. Rather than thinking about, I want to fully transform my business overnight by embracing all of these advanced capabilities, which will take time and obviously comes with enhanced change management. And I think it's understanding what does the start of the journey look like, what's enough on day one, but it's also acknowledging that sometimes I might need those advanced capabilities, sometimes I don't. And it's about right sizing the fit for you so that you ultimately end up with the right product to meet your needs.
So do you, Simon, not just based on your experience, the reason why these fail, or Gartner sees them failing about 50% of the time, is that just unrealistic expectations, unrealistic sales, or a combination of a miscommunication, or is it more just a preparation issue?
I think historically, clients coming to this are coming to it from a world where they've had nothing, or maybe they're moving from a CLM that failed to another CLM. And in that situation, they're hoping to not repeat the same mistakes. What they're looking for more often or not in that scenario is to find the trusted advisor on the vendor side who is here to be their guiding light and say, this is what success looks like for you, and this is the journey that we're going to go on. I'm going to be candid with you about what that's going to take. I'm going to tell you the things that you really need to do before you go on this journey. I might even tell you that you're simply not ready yet, and we should really have this conversation again in 6 months' time. Customers are looking for that guidance and that trusted advisor, consultative advisory services, whereas what historically they've received is typically a salesperson saying, buy my product, right? And a combination of not necessarily knowing exactly what I'm looking for, combined with everything's going to be fine, just sign here, tends to be, those two worlds collide once you hit implementation.
So I think this is a good time to have our first poll. Those of you who are watching, we do have a poll up. Where are you currently in your CLM implementation journey? A, you don't have a CLM at all. B, you're currently looking for a CLM. C, you're switching. D, you're currently implementing. Or E, you have one and you have one. And while folks are answering that, I think Richard Concanon has and I apologize, Richard, if I messed up your name. How easy is it or difficult is it to start with what you want on day one, then add more bells and whistles as you need them?
So it's a great question, Richard. So it's actually very, very easy, provided that you're in a position where the vendor has worked with you to scope what it is you need and build you a phased and realistic rollout plan. Turning additional capability on later is much, much easier than trying to boil the ocean up front, turn on too much capability and then iterate, and you end up in, let's call it analysis paralysis, where you're just constantly changing things, trying to make something work, trying to fit a business process, because you've ultimately tried to embrace too much in one go. And we'll talk about this actually in a slide later on. Jerry and I will both share some perspectives on this and give a lot more concrete examples. But the net is, it is actually much easier to build a phased, manageable deployment of the technology.
Great. So I think we can see the results now. All of you hopefully can see the results. 12% said that they don't have a CLM. Thank you. We actually had 75% of the people vote, so I really appreciate that. This is almost a realistic poll. About 42% are currently looking, and then 15% respectively are switching, implementing, or have one. So I think that's a good thing to note, is that a lot of you are in the position where you're learning still, and I think that's a good place to be. So let's talk about some of the mistakes. We originally were talking about the common errors. let's talk about some of the mistakes you made. And I think the first mistake that we see, and I've seen and Simon's seen, has been a lack of readiness. So Simon, let's talk a little bit about how you can be ready and how you can avoid it. Because, you know, what is it that folks are showing up where they're not ready, but they think they are? What is driving that?
It's a great question, Jerry. More often or not, it's that they are taking a technology first approach. I see CLM, in fact, I see any digital transformation program that involves technology. Technology is really the enabler at the end of that journey, as opposed to what defines its success. The classic example then is if we think about what is your contracting operating model, that is, what are the processes that you use today? Are those processes what you want to take forward into the new world? What roles and responsibilities, service delivery model, what governance structure do you have? What's your overall risk appetite and strategy as a business? What are your data and analytics needs? Those things can all be defined in a technology agnostic way long before you push the button to buy the CLM. And what we often find is clients use the CLM project as almost as leverage internally to justify doing the target operating model design, but doing it in the middle of an implementation. And clearly at that point in time, the implementation partner or the CLM vendor, whoever it is that's ultimately delivering the technology into the end client, faces a challenge now, because this isn't now just a case of we understand your requirements and we're deploying the solution. Suddenly it's very iterative. Suddenly we are trying to define or design the target state on the fly. Now, the counter argument to that from the client's perspective is, well, I'm buying this tech and clearly it works in a certain way. So surely I have to a certain extent, pigeonhole my target operating model into the way that your product works. To a certain extent, because clearly each product will work in a certain way. But broadly speaking, coming to the table, having defined those things, having defined your contracting taxonomy. What do I mean by that? I mean your contract categories, buy side, sell side, your contract types, your master data requirements. What are your universal contract data needs, things that are going to transcend contract types? What are your data needs that are specific to certain contract types? What are the end-to-end workflow processes that we're looking to leverage? Those kinds of things can all be done long before the implementation starts. And you can run this in parallel, but if you try to run it in parallel, you just need to be cognizant that that's going to materially impact the time that it takes to deliver the technology first and foremost.
So if I was going to take this in the two things, one thing you mentioned, sorry, let me step back there and let my brain catch up with my mouth. You mentioned something very interesting that I want to dive a little bit into. We know, as we're here at ContractPod, we know that not every CLM is the same. And, I always point out, it's a very friendly, cordial community of legal technology people. But why do so many lawyers and legal technology professionals and allied professionals think that all CLM systems are the same and it's just grab documents from one and put them in another, everything works? Why do you think that is the case? Because you touched on this briefly.
Question. Yeah, it's a great question. I think they're marketed very, very similarly. I think if I was to do a Google search for very specific functionality that I'm looking for, if I type in obligation management for CLM, I'm going to find every CLM vendor does that. But the way in which every CLM vendor does that could be dramatically different. And I think this will come on to one of the points that we discuss in one of the subsequent mistakes, which is when you're vetting products, really get under the covers of what it is that you're looking for and make sure you see it. Because more often or not, what happens is you might get through the demo and you look at your scorecard and you say, oh, I didn't see the obligation management. Do you do obligation management? Yes, we do. Tick. No. The analogy I have there is if I'm going into the car garage and I'm looking to buy a coupe, if I walk in and the salesperson says, well, here's a truck, I know it's not the same thing, but take my word for it. You're going to get exactly the same experience. I'm going to say, no, thanks. I'll come back when you can show me the coupe. And so I think there's a lot of marketing and a lot of messaging and a lot of terminology that is used that is first and foremost interchangeable between vendors, but is also open to interpretation by the buyer.
So if you basically, this is for those of you who don't know, before Simon heard about my experience yesterday, I took my car to the shop, and it's there for a couple of nights because the console that displays the speed is broken, and they gave me the choice between the same model car as a loaner or a Miata, a Mazda Miata. And I really, really wanted the Miata, but I know I wouldn't be able to fit anything in it for the next week. On the other hand, I would not be here because I'd be driving with my top down throughout everywhere. So I think there is, you have to decide, you do have to be aware of the differences between the vehicle you choose for CLM. And Simon, one other question that I have about readiness today is what's the first thing that you think anyone should do, bar none, across the board? We know that there's no perfect solution, but what would you think is the top thing to do before looking for a CLM when you're getting started?
Great question. I think it's a current state assessment, and by that I mean a really detailed and thorough one. More often or not, clients go through the exercise of gathering requirements, and they create RFP documents and they create lists of functional requirements. In fact, I don't remember the last time I saw an RFP that really articulated the pain points across the organization. What I tend to see every single time is a feature list. And I think a current state assessment allows you to truly uncover where is there pain in my current operating model? Where are things broken and what presents an opportunity for improvement? And that, to my point earlier about the tech agnostic operating model, you might uncover through that there are a bunch of things that you can do through improvements in your internal policies and procedures, in simplification of your current approval process, changing your processes dramatically. Those are things that could materially impact the pain that you experience today before you've even thought about solving anything or enabling this through technology. So doing that detailed discovery around what is my current pain and what opportunities does this present to me, that's critical because it lays the foundations to what your real needs are. It also lays the foundations to the business case around this initiative. Can I justify it? What do I expect the time savings and cost savings to be? So I think current state assessment is absolutely the best place to start. What I would also say, putting my sort of former Big Four hat on, is that's something that you may not be able or willing to conduct yourself. You might not have the resources internally to do that. So bringing in external advisory partners to be able to conduct that. It may only be a 4 to 6 week program of work, but to get out of that a true independent summary of where you are on the contracting maturity scale and where you think you might want to be in the future. And just on that maturity piece, if you're gauging on a scale of 1 to 5 and you're currently a 1, but you want to be a 5, go into that knowing that that is a journey. And that buying CLM tech is not going to immediately jump you from a 1 to a 5. There's an awful lot that needs to happen in between that.
Well, it sounds like there's one of the other mistakes that you might make is underestimating the work to roll out a CLM.
What a great segue, Jerry.
Thank you, Jen. There we go. So we know, based on what we just talked about, a mistake number one is that it's not just a technological solution, it's a people and human and business solution. And one thing that we've learned here at ContractPodAi is contract lifecycle management interfaces for almost all of our customers. It's not just a legal solution or procurement solution. It's a completely interactive with the rest of the organization. So, what is, on this slide, we see the CLM system, being cross-functional, interacting with customer relationship management, human resources management, enterprise resource planning, supply chain management. You know, how does that work? You know, what's realistic here? If I came to you today as a customer and said, how long is this going to take? Is the answer going to be a week? Is it going to be 6 years? Or is it going to be, hey, well, let's figure this out, because every organization is different? And I probably just gave you all the answers, but
You did.
Yeah. So what do you think? How does that go?
I think it's definitely a case of each organization is different, but what it's also needs to acknowledge is that regardless of whether those of you on this call are from smaller mid-market organizations with maybe relatively nimble legal teams, or whether you are large enterprises with huge procurement functions and thousands of salespeople, whatever it might be, it typically means that integration, in order to truly realize the benefits of the CLM, is a primary driver. There's lots of tech that you can buy that doesn't need to be integrated to fully realize the benefits. And I think with CLM, I see it almost as the transactional core or the glue that holds together your enterprise business, because ultimately every single contract that flows through the business needs to touch these other transactional systems in some way. And so clearly, sometimes smaller clients will come to us and say, well, I don't have a procurement platform. It's absolutely fine. You don't need to have one. But what I would say is that even the smallest of organizations tend to come to us and say, but I definitely have a CRM, or I definitely have one of these things. And then, of course, as you go into larger enterprises, and depending on whether the scope of the program is buy side, sell side, enterprise-wide CLM, the number of touch points that are required across the piece can be significant. Recently working on a project with a client that has 35 different integrations. And, that's a natural extreme maybe, but what that also means is it would be foolish for me or anyone to sit in front of the client and say, you're going to be up and running in a few weeks. It is a journey, and it's about understanding and building a plan to get there, acknowledging that you're not going to be able to change everything or do everything overnight. So the other key thing here is legal. I like to describe legal as the custodian of the CLM, as opposed to the owner of the CLM. And the reason that I say that is because ultimately there's a perception that because contracts are kind of legal's thing, legal owns this process. Legal must choose the CLM. Legal has to find the budget for the CLM. But actually, particularly in enterprise, the chances are that the person who uses the CLM the least at the end of this journey is actually legal. They will clearly use it. But if we think about the self-service business enablement model, most of the people, and Jerry, you and I were talking about this even within our own organization where we use our own product, who uses it the most? It's mostly our sales teams that use ContractPod. And so mostly you'll find that the throughput through the CLM is the sales teams or the procurement teams, maybe the finance teams. And then legal are obviously coming in and engaging at the points at which contracts deviate in such a way that presents some kind of additional risk that requires them to play a role in the process. And so as a result, if you looked at it on a kind of bar chart, you'd probably see that legal's footprint in the CLM usage is some of the lowest. And where we sometimes see mistakes here is when it's purely a legal-led project. There's no IT representation. There's no business representation. There are some situations where I would say it's actually worse than that, where it's legal-led with an acknowledgement that the business play a role, but the business don't have a seat at the project table. And then legal are defining, these are the fields that the business user needs to fill in. These are the things that the business use, and those business SMEs are not present or part of the project. So having that kind of cross-functional acknowledgement up front that this is this needs input and investment from all of those teams. And the other thing I would say is very rare, particularly in enterprise, very, very rare for legal to have the budget to push the button and buy the end-to-end CLM. So thinking about this from your CRO's perspective or your CFO's perspective or your chief procurement officer's perspective, those are the stakeholders alongside the GC and others who can actually make a complete investment in this technology. Some customers create almost a slush fund, if you will, of different contributions from different teams to fund this program, because they acknowledge that first and foremost, legal won't get the budget, or legal alone won't see the full realized business case benefits. But if we combine our resources, we'll end up with something that really, really adds up from a business case perspective.
And I think that's really true. And I see that we do have another question in the Q&A. I do want to touch on that question, Rachel, but I think we're going to get to it in a moment in the next slide when we start talking about that. So if we haven't answered it there, I will absolutely get back to your question. One thing that I like to share is how much of this is actually true. I was previously the general counsel of a large software company, global software company. My first CLM implementation, I did it myself. I went out, I got the software, I did everything, and I told the sales team and everybody else, here's how you're going to use it. And the sales team said, we hate it, we refuse to use it. And I spent the next year basically doing reverse engineering everything so that it would work for everybody. And the second time, I'll say the first thing that I did with ContractPodAi was say, here is the internal team that I'm going to work with. Here's who's going to be supporting me from sales. Here's who's supporting me from there. So I think the idea is you need to know, even if you start with a legal platform, that you just say, even if your first step is, you know what, we're going to take the contracts, all you have to do is click a button, we're going to take them in and start getting them into the system. You don't have to do anything else. You want to begin planning for the amount of interconnectivity that's going to go on. And sometimes, and to be fair, I think we do say, we have clients who put it live to every department, every organization, every subsidiary across the globe in one shot. They do it they say, it's all ready. We're going live across the globe today. And then we have some that say, we're going to go country by country or division by division, because it's going to be an internal decision. And I wish that we could say that we have our magic wand and that we could say that everything's going to be perfect each time. But every organization, every business is a different creature. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that one thing that I think, and Simon, please tell me if you think I'm wrong, one thing that I think a good vendor will do is try to understand a little bit more about your organization so that they can give you better feedback. Because if they don't, if they say, this is how everybody does it, so therefore it will work for you, well, that may not work if your general counsel and the legal team is based in the United States and sales is headquartered out of Germany. And because you're going to have different competing interests. And it's not that they don't all have the same goal of making money and having the company do well. It's that they may see things operate different ways, or the time difference, or just different ways they interact. So, I think that having these stakeholders involved from day one is very important, but also making sure that the vendor understands and that you actually understand as the customer what you're implementing and what your goal is. If your goal is, and again, Simon, please feel free to jump in and cut me off. I'm wrong. I'm very wrong a lot of the time. But I feel like if you are going it alone, you're going to ultimately end up having problems later on. But if you're working with your team and you're able to bring that in, and I do want to talk about internal champions and stakeholders when we talk about change management a little more. But is there anything you'd really like to add there, Simon?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Where I've seen challenges is where the project is significantly under-resourced from the beginning, because it's similar to how you ran your first project, right? You're wearing the GC hat, you're wearing the project manager's hat, you're standardizing all of your templates, you're making design decisions on behalf of the business. That, to your point, doesn't end up with successful outcomes. The flip side to all of this is that it does ultimately depend on the size and scale of the deployment as to how long this is going to take. Vendors often talk about you can be up and running in weeks or months, and you truly can. But what you have to take from that is that you're up and running with something. And that could be your phase one, your MVP. Vendors, we don't like words like pilot and POC. We want you to be straight into the value. But the truth is, having something stress tested upfront, simple, deployable, quick, rapid, quick wins. The migration exercise is always one that I find interesting. Working with a client at the moment, and it's 320,000 legacy contracts. And they want to be able to do everything in one go and move it all across. And we can do that. We can absolutely do that. What you as the client need to be cognizant of is, does that unlock value quickly? Because that will ultimately take many weeks or months. And so ultimately being able to be in a position where even within that migration talk track, you can create milestones, working, as you say, in collaboration with your client to understand what's really important to them and their business, to say, hey, we've got 320,000 here, but the 50,000 active contracts, they've all been done. I don't like migrating expired contracts, but sometimes I accept that from an audit and compliance perspective, they have to come in. So, we're going to do the first tranche of those, and that's going to be the contracts that expired in the last 24 months, because those are the ones that you most frequently access. But you build a plan to get them the value in incremental bite-sized chunks, rather than we're migrating, we'll let you know in 6 months when it's done. Because that also creates a lot of nervousness and trepidation in the business, particularly if you, the client, having to report up to your senior stakeholders to say, how's it going? Still migrating. Where's the value? We've spent a lot of money on this. I want to see something. It's not ready yet. It's not ready yet. So from our perspective, again, being cognizant of the effort involved, but also trying to plot a course that gets you something quickly, which I guess to a certain extent, Jerry, is probably a nice segue into our next slide.
Well, yes, let's talk about the third mistake. We here, we hear a lot, and Simon just talked about it, is boiling the ocean, trying to do everything on day one. And so Simon mentioned phases and getting this. And part of this is knowing your target state and defining the way you get there. Can you talk a little bit about what you're looking at? We call this crawl, walk, run. You can see it if you are watching today. You do see crawl, walk, run on your screen, and that's really about initiating, iterating, and evolving as time goes on. You talked about this briefly in the last section. What would your advice be to someone who says, I want everything working on day one, and that's the only thing I'm going to take?
All possible. Time and money and resources, it's all possible. I think the challenge here is, more often or not, and we saw this in the poll results earlier, more often or not, I'm not in a position where I've done this before. This is relatively uncharted territory for me. So as a direct result, the idea that I walk in knowing nothing about this, really just having an idea in my head of what it is that I think that I want, the idea that I'm going to land flawlessly and execute perfectly the hallelujah moment and deliver the perfect solution in a big bang way is simply unrealistic. There's so much that you will learn on the job. There's so much that you don't yet understand about the technology's capabilities, or perhaps a feature works in a particular way and you didn't realize it was going to work that way. And so as a result, the idea of start small, let's focus on something that's going to deliver maximum value, but let's learn from that as we go through this process. And when we say learn from it, this is where I see a key mistake, because CLM platforms are highly configurable. And I will always use the word configurable, not customizable, because we're in the spirit of trying to make this fit your needs in a way that uses the out-of-the-box platform rather than building bespoke solutions that don't scale. Because it's highly configurable, you can end up in this situation where you hit UAT for phase one, and then you go, now I'm starting to realize that I can do these things that I didn't appreciate. Can we just add another 10 form fields to the MSA intake form? Can we just add another step in the workflow? Actually, do you know what? I forgot there's this additional approval step. It's absolutely essential that goes in there before we go live. And what you end up with is that UAT that should be a 2, 3, 4 week window suddenly ends up, you're just constantly iterating. You're just iterating and you're never achieving anything. And that's something which I've seen many, many times over the last 13 years, is being locked in that cycle of iterative change and never really having anybody say, enough's enough. What does good look like? And I think that's another piece of the vendor conundrum, is vendors have historically tried to please their clients by saying, sure, we can do that. Sure, we can do that. Rather than, and I'm a firm believer in focusing on how do you set your customer up for success, as opposed to how do you satisfy them. And so I'm very much, in my team is sort of focused on how do we be prescriptive with our clients? How do we give them guidance and advisory services? But more importantly, how do we tell them no? Now, that's not in your best interests, or actually going down that path is a bad idea for these reasons. When another client tried it, it didn't end very well. Being able to steer you in the right direction and focus all the time on what does success look like and how are we going to measure it. And I think if we can get that and identify it and then build a phased rollout plan, it's really just about executing on each one of those promises and unlocking value. I think that's the absolute key. The other thing I would say, Jerry, is devil's in the detail. So, and as an example, worked on a project a couple of years ago where the initial scope on paper appeared to be very narrow. It was an internal audit had flagged some issues with a particular contract type. So the scope of the first phase of the project was just to solve for this one contract type. That's fantastic. Going contract type by contract type is another very effective way of delivering CLM. The challenge was, and I didn't work for the vendor at the time, I inherited this project as an implementation partner. Once we got into the project, we realized that the one contract type was actually over 50 different contract templates, all of which were in different languages. So all of a sudden, what had been committed as a really discrete, small, sort of up and running in sort of 6 to 8 weeks with this one contract type, there was no way we were going to fully automate 50 contract templates in 8 weeks, not to mention that none of them had been harmonized or standardized by the client beforehand, and the client expected the CLM vendor to do that for them. So there was a huge disconnect right at the beginning. So again, I think the key thing I'd say there is devil's in the detail.
And I think that's a good point. You've talked a lot about the vendor side, but from the customer standpoint, I think it's important and again, I'm an active user of our system. I go through this. I've had to harmonize these myself or work with outside counsel. There is a preparation step for everybody to make sure this works. If you have, 500 different contracts, or as Simon just talked about, there are 50 contracts. You have 50 different MSAs, and each MSA is different, is mostly the same, but maybe there's different languages, or maybe there's different rules. It's important to get that harmonization done and get that all taken care of, because that will help the vendor and you, while it does put a little more work into the implementation process. Getting that harmonization done with outside counsel or another group, an ALSP, ALSP, alternative legal service provider, getting that done really does make everything go smoother, because you're suddenly able to get more insight throughout the entire organization. Why does this clause appear in the Japanese version of our master agreement, but it's not in the Australian version of the master agreement? Is it a choice of law issue, or is it that there's a specific service we provide in Japan that we don't offer in Australia? So, and again, not every company has those issues, but I have found having, as someone who uses a CLM daily, I found that catching these, there's always that iteration. There's always that, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? Let's correct these things and then get to the next step. with that, I would like to go on to our second poll. So, we talked a little bit about internal stakeholders a moment ago. How do you think, our guest today, how do you think you best engage internal stakeholders? Is it A, developing digital transformation plans with their input? B, communicating the project in terms that resonate with them? C, understanding their individual KPIs, their individual key performance indicators, prioritizing their needs? Or E, understanding who they are? I'll give everyone a moment for that. And while you're answering that, we'll give you about a minute. Rachel, I think we can talk a little bit about your question. And Rachel's question is, are there a certain number of APIs or integrations that are ideal? She's in a large enterprise, or Rachel is in a large enterprise, so they will have more API connections than less. So is there a point, Simon, where risk exists, or is it simply a matter of well-established setup?
So it's a great question. Sometimes we'll come into enterprises and there will be a huge technology landscape to integrate to. Sometimes those enterprises will say, don't worry about that though, we've centralized all of our master data, or we have a middleware component that allows your system to communicate with all of our platforms. So from your perspective, just integrate with this middleware and it will go and talk to the rest of the application stack. Fantastic. There are other times where we will go in and there won't be any of that framework. SAP or Oracle or other ERP P2P platforms are a classic example where we're working with a client at the moment, and it's a global deployment and they have 20 different SAP instances. Some of them are on premise, some of them are Ariba, some of them are S/4HANA Cloud, and none of them have a generic integration framework that allows us to effectively communicate once and not have to worry about doing all of these bespoke integrations. So in that scenario, we're then in a situation where it's really important we uncover that information up front before we undertake the implementation, because again, what we don't want to say as a vendor is we're integrating to SAP and then discover actually that that's 20 separate independent integrations. So trying to map what all of those needs are up front, but to your point, Rachel, prioritizing, because we're never going to integrate to all of them overnight. Which ones are essential? Some of them may be legacy products, some may be in sunset in the future. Your technology strategy might be changing internally. In our experience, other digital transformation programs that are happening alongside ours will inevitably, in a large enterprise, have some technical debt or impact on the CLM program. So being able to try and look at it and say, well, where are there quick wins on the integration landscape perspective? Where are the must-haves? The basics, like I must have some kind of single sign-on Active Directory authentication, through to I must have basic e-signature integration. And what we try and do in those situations is for the cookie cutter integrations, we try and come to you with very prescriptive, or vendors should come to you with very prescriptive out-of-the-box adapters. You want to integrate with Salesforce? No problem. There's an adapter for that. We have that ready to go. Where it gets more complicated is maybe you're in a specific industry vertical, maybe you're in financial services, for example, and the requirement is to integrate with all of the trading platforms and transactional systems within the bank, which may be bespoke applications or things that we don't integrate with every single day. So in those scenarios, it's a case of prioritizing and saying, well, we can do those. Are they critical on day one? Do they need to be something that comes later? Do we do the basic integrations first? But the net is there's always an opportunity to try and put some guardrails around it. And again, I think that's something that vendors historically have been guilty of, is just say yes, rather than say, here's some exceptions, or here's some prescriptive insight as to what we think is the right approach.
So thank you, Simon. Let's take a look at the answer to the poll, which has disappeared. By the way, for those of you who realize, the actual answer is all of the above, but we didn't give that to you because we wanted to actually see what you thought was the most important. And it seems like 37% of you said communicating the project in terms that resonate with them. And I think that's really important, because one good way to get people to do something, to make a change that's positive is to talk about how it benefits them and how it will help them work better. But all of these are really key points. It's just where you're going to start from as that engaging that stakeholder. And I think all of these are very good points. They're all part of one larger engagement plan. So every answer is correct. Don't feel bad if you didn't answer. It didn't answer. But I think they all matter. But it's clear that some of you agree with me that communicating in a way that they understand the benefit is a key thing. So let's talk about the fourth mistake, and then we're going to get on to, we do have one or two questions left. We've talked a little bit before about change management and expectation management. And in fact, a lot of the slides here, a lot of the discussion has been about managing expectations. So Simon, we do have 3 points on here: accepting that no solution is perfect, ensuring active engagement. And for those of you who are looking, this ties right in with the poll question, and understanding the new use cases, especially those with AI. What have you seen? And if we could, I know we've only got a few minutes left, some quick hits on what have you seen in your experience that have worked for user adoption? What would you say is your top 3 ways to get user adoption? I guess is a good way to look at that.
There's got to be carrot and stick. There has to be the piece that was in the poll. What's in it for me, and have I effectively communicated to the business what the benefits are? Anecdotally, an example, I spoke about this at Clock, but it's a natural extreme. But my team went to deliver training to the end user community for a customer about 18 months ago, and there were about 30 people in the room on the customer side. And we started the training, and somebody put their hand up at the front and said, sorry, what's CLM and why am I here? And that to me was the natural extreme of how the change journey and adoption journey has broken down. Nobody in that room had any prior communication as to, we're thinking about going on a digital transformation journey. Here's an update on where we are on our digital transformation journey. Guess what? We've successfully procured a technology solution, folks. We'd like to demo it to you. We'd like to show you what it's going to do for your day job. All of those things that happen way before end user training on an implementation, none of those things had happened. And I think if there was one thing I would say, you must over and effectively communicate the benefits throughout this program, and you have to be really creative about how you do that. We have a client, I always love meeting this particular client, because when we come on the webcam, his background is try the new CLM. And it's, and we love it because he's talking about, how do I get the message out there in more creative ways to my business users about this transformation program. He says, I've got a digital marketing campaign. If I walk in the office, there's a big banner on the wall saying, have you tried the new CLM? And there's something on the SharePoint about it. He says, but I've got to find more creative ways of really emphasizing what this change journey is about. And he just happens to use his backdrop on his Teams. And I think it's thinking in that creative way about how do you deliver the change, but then how do you reinforce it? How do you check that everybody's comfortable? As a vendor, we don't own the change journey. We have very little control over it, to be honest. We come into the training and we deliver the end user training, and that's a piece where we really touch your change journey. But other than that, the best thing we can do is give you guidance and recommendations, but it's up to you, or you with a dedicated advisory partner, and there are some fantastic partners out there who just deliver change management services to manage that change in the business. And I couldn't stress enough, start early and over communicate.
One question, and we have avoided mentioning what is the words of the year, artificial intelligence, throughout most of this discussion.
Done well.
But we're going to spend a moment or two. We are ContractPodAi. What are a couple of myths or barriers you hear about artificial intelligence and CLM, and how do you address those? And I know that's a big question. So
it's a great question. So I worked for originally the first CLM vendor to introduce AI in their product. And when we did it, I can honestly say nobody in the sales team had any idea what it was, and no buyer had any clear understanding of what they were getting. And it sold like wildfire. And then I'm sure some of you have seen the trough of disillusionment that then occurred probably around 2020, when all of a sudden everybody who'd gone through that first journey in 2017, 2018 suddenly realized that actually this is garbage and it doesn't work. And suddenly there was this huge shift in disappointment, and everybody suddenly became very, very skeptical about AI. I think what that's actually done is that's actually encouraged people to take more of a closer look and to try and scratch beneath the surface to actually define what AI means to them as a business. And I think we're in an interesting world now where, having gone through that trough of disillusionment, we've now skyrocketed back up because of the whole, I guess, the whole industry, the whole world gravitating around generative AI and GPT, etc. Suddenly we've shot back right up on the hype curve. The distinction this time, I think, is that the hype is justified. Those early adopters that failed, that didn't really work out. This is very different. And I think globally, we are seeing a shift in terms of everybody's mindsets that this time round it's different. I think the key thing is, don't rely on it. See it as an extra bell or whistle within your arsenal of tools within your CLM that can assist you, but it's not designed in any way, shape or form to replace you. And I think anyone who comes in and says, so I'm looking for AI and I'm expecting your tool to negotiate the contract completely autonomously, and no human review, and it just goes out the door. The technology can get part of the way there. In fact, who knows where it might be in 6 to 12 months' time. But that's not the intent. The intent is to offer you some level of assistance that frees you up to focus on the target concern areas, the risks, but also is that friendly legal assistant on your shoulder that's pointing out, hey, you missed this piece. This is important. I think you need to think about it in that way, rather than thinking about it as something that does weird and wonderful and wildly enthusiastic things. Don't rely on it. See it as something that simply embeds on top of the existing base capability.
My preference, and if you've heard, Simon, I know you've heard me say this before, is I don't think of AI as being artificial intelligence. I like to refer to it as being augmented intelligence. That the goal of these systems, at least, and obviously we know that there are bad actors out there. We know that there are folks out there who want to do different things. But the goal of these systems should be to augment what you do as a human, not to replace you, not to take you out of this picture, but to make you better. And we do know that humans working with AIs, especially lawyers and legal professionals, have significant benefits from having that extra set of eyes in solving some of these problems. I know we're running out of time. I do want to get to one. I want to thank everyone for attending. I do want to answer Kimberly's question. Do you recommend giving RFP respondents a copy of your company's contract policy and asking them the preliminary scope of response to implementation strategy based on that policy? Simon, can you answer Kimberly's question?
So it's a great question. So what we do is we actually have a dedicated scoping questionnaire, which is designed to really hone in on exactly what it is that you're looking to accomplish. But we also have a dedicated scoping methodology, which is designed to really uncover where are the pain points, where are the opportunities. Maybe you've already uncovered that, but if you haven't, we can help you. Plot them in terms of where is there most or least pain within the organization. Think about then, how do you unlock benefits and value through certain capabilities in the product? This is the classic making sure you've understood the pain points before you build your feature request list. And then consider all the other moving parts. Are there particular territories that are more mature and should go first? Was there a result of an internal audit that means you have to start with this particular territory? Are you going through an M&A exercise that forces you to prioritize that as the first thing that you tackle? We consider all of those moving parts. and then look to validate with you that we've understood them correctly and build you an implementation roadmap. One of the things that's always challenging at RFP stage is we don't get the opportunity to ask or have the conversation as part of the RFP to provide that level of insight. It's normally something that occurs once a vendor is down selected. And one of the things I wish we could do is have the opportunity to ask those questions earlier in the process rather than going through a kind of traditional procurement process where we can just submit some questions and get some answers. But a topic for another day, I'm sure.
Everybody, I would like to thank you for those of you who have joined us today. If you'd like to learn more, come visit us at www.ContractPodAi.com or search for ContractPodAi. Feel free to connect with myself or Simon on LinkedIn. Our names are our names. We're easy to find, and I dare say we both actually look like our pictures. So, again, thank you for coming. We hope that this has been enjoyable and educational, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, folks.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.